Welcome back to the third part of Images and History of Architecture and Industry along Winchester's railroads. The final category of buildings we'll talk about is by far the grandest in terms of architectural style. The depots, freight stations, and nearby hotels were the showcases of optimism, innovation, and prosperity that came with the railroads. These were the first buildings that had to solve the problems of selling tickets, moving people and their baggage, and the mass transportation of goods, and they handled it very well. There was a mania about the railroad that was likened to medieval Europe by an architectural journal in 1875. Railway termini and hotels are to the 19th century what monasteries and cathedrals were to the 13th century. They are truly the only real representative building we possess. Our metropolitan termini have been leaders in the art spirit of our time. As is fairly typical of Winchester, our buildings would never be held up as the pinnacles of the architectural zeitgeist, but they are still solid, well-constructed, and attractive buildings. The first railroad building constructed after the Civil War was the B&O Depot on North Cameron Street. The building was a fairly modest Gothic Revival-style building, looking almost like a house. Gothic Revival is a fairly rare style in Winchester, but this was one of the early preferred styles for railroad construction. Constructed soon after the depot was the freight house. Although it's a more utilitarian building than the depot, the architects still included elements of Gothic ornamentation with an unexpectedly fine brick gable on the northern face. The two buildings are outlined here on the Sanborn map, with the depot in yellow and the freight station in pink. The fertilizer building is Baker & Company's fertilizer warehouse on what is today Baker Street. A part of the freight station is still standing today and is used by our local model railroad club. The depot, on the other hand, has been demolished. It was used for a short time as the B&O offices, but Winchester must have outgrown its passenger depot fairly quickly. In 1892 or 1893, the Romanesque Revival-style depot at the corner of Piccadilly and Kent Streets opened. This is where you can really see the idea of the railroad buildings as churches, with its heavy block construction, the multiple roof levels, towers, and spires. The passenger station stopped regular service on Saturday, August 13th, 1949, but excursion trains still continued into the 1960s. With the last excursion being an apple blossom trip sometime in the 1980s. Today the building is still in use as the offices for Winchester and Western and CSX. Hotels went hand in hand with the passenger depots. We've briefly mentioned some hotels in the earlier parts, which include the George Washington Hotel near the B&O Depot, which has recently been restored, and the Hart Hotel, which was near the Grychen Glove Factory, which has been demolished. But the hotel that seemed designed to be the crowning jewel of the destination hotels in Winchester was the Winchester Inn, on the west side of town on the Cumberland Valley Railroad. The Winchester Inn was one of the largest resort hotels in the Shenandoah Valley, with a capacity of 250 people. The following descriptions were taken from various advertisements for the inn from 1905 to 1915. The first impression of the inn, with its handsomely arched porches, balconies, imposing architecture, and velvety lawns, is one of substantial comfort, roominess, and elegance. The rooms feature all modern conveniences, private baths, marble mantels, electric bells, and steam heat. The high attic over the third floor makes rooms cool in the summer. The extensive lawns afford a grand outing place for the guests. Outdoor activities include tennis and croquet courts, saddle horses, and automobiling. If the weather turns poor, the building is nearly encircled with verandas to take in the views of the valley, or you could head to the ballroom staffed with dance instructors. All of this would cost you about $7 to $18 a week in 1905. To put that in perspective, about $200 to $500 in 2015 money. Despite all of these amenities, the Winchester Inn never seemed to gain any traction. It was apparently used only during the summer and early fall, marketed towards Washington, D.C. guests, and some years it seems it did not open at all. Frederick Morton, writing in 1925, said, "The hotel proved a white elephant, and though it cost $100,000, it was sold after 10 years for little more than 1/3 that sum, and was subsequently torn down in 1919. Before the Winchester Inn was demolished, it did serve as a scene for some of the famous panoramic photographs taken of Winchester, which include the Cumberland Valley Railroad passenger depot. You can see the very distinctive roof lines of the depot in this photo. The depot was unfortunately demolished for a filling station between the 1930s to the 1940s. Like before, the aerial view has the passenger depot outlined in yellow and the freight station in pink. Today you can see the Handy Mart at the passenger station location and Winchester Little Theater in the old Pennsylvania freight station. The freight station was constructed circa 1890 by E. H. Diffenderfer. From the Winchester Times of 1889, the building was described as brick with a slate roof and will be a handsome building, 2 stories, each with a height of 10 feet, with an elevator for raising freight to the 2nd story. A large platform, 8 feet wide, extends all around the building. When completed by these master mechanics, we will guarantee that the structure will be a tribute to their skill and good workmanship. Unlike a lot of buildings that we've talked about in this presentation, the freight station found a new use fairly soon after it was sold by the railroad. The Winchester Little Theater bought the building in 1974. Even so, the building had been altered to remove some prominent architectural features, like the slate roof. The removal of the slate roof before it reached its expected lifespan of 75 to 100 years is probably a symptom of a larger underlying problem which is still threatening the building today. The theater has been working diligently on a preservation plan, which includes restoring the eyebrow dormers and the slate roof. To bring this idea into fruition, much of the work is engineering that is going into the rafters to alleviate the thrust issues which are threatening to bring the building down. The Little Theater is still working on their fundraising at this point to make their restoration a reality. PHW has contributed $26,000 and is committed to donating our Bow and Dough Shop proceeds again this year from the Holiday House Tour. But they still need your help to meet their goals. You can visit them online at www.wltonline.org. They have a PayPal donate button toward the bottom of their webpage to make it easy and quick to drop a few dollars into their Restoration Campaign Fund bucket. Before we open this up to some of the audience questions, I want to extend special thanks to the Stuart Bell Jr. Archives, Morale Calbian, Tim Machado, and the Winchester Little Theater crew for sharing their knowledge, as well as these other sources and those documented on the individual slides. This program would not have been possible without them.
Yes. Quick question. You may have already answered this and I just missed it. What was the leather prior to this change you just mentioned? What was the leather used for primarily that they harvested?
Leather was used for making those fancy gloves. And the sumac was said to be very good for especially like kid skin and goat skin, to make it very supple, but also keep the leather kind of like on the beige side instead of going to a darker color leather. You know, instead of like a rich mahogany, it was kept it to the beige color. So.
These were exported to other areas of
Mm-hmm.
the country?
Yes, a lot of the sumac in Winchester apparently went up to Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and some of it went to Richmond, but I don't know that it went on the railroads down to Richmond.
Sandra, did this become the Owen and Trinary Glove Factory?
Yes, it did. Gretchen Glove Factory on North Cameron Street, and I've seen it's the same building with the Owen and Trinary Glove Factory. So I would imagine they just changed the name when ownership changed.
I can pipe in for
Yeah.
Sandra turned me on to a book
Yes.
recently called Weaving a Common Thread, so if you're interested in more of that
Yep.
history that she speaks of there, it's a fabulous book.
Yes.
And I didn't even know of its existence until you let me know about it. It
Yes.
talks about everything she's speaking about right now.
Yes, in much more detail. I mean, I cut so much out of this lecture to try and get our 45 minutes to an hour. But all of these industries in Winchester were basically interconnected. The Glaze families, the bakers, all of the fruit growers, Cathers and Luptons. It's really remarkable to kind of read through these names. It's a who's who of Winchester about 1900. And it's remarkable because you don't necessarily think now of businesses, you know, working together and trying to come up with things for the common good, especially like the Apple cold storage. They did a really good job on that, kind of foreseeing the need for it and creating the cold storage before it became a crisis and a lot of the crops were lost, you know, just because they couldn't move them out to market fast enough to keep up with their production.
Was Winchester during this time considered a prosperous area by surrounding communities, and people maybe wanted to come here for opportunities, job opportunities?
I would say a lot of this was actually internally driven to try and make Winchester prosperous.
There was real planning.
Yes, definitely. It wasn't, I mean, I don't want to say it wasn't organic because, you know, it was, but, you know, these people had a vision on how to make the most out of Winchester and really grow it after the Civil War.
Again,
Yes.
sorry to interrupt. Was the downtown area of Winchester during this time, was it mostly industrial business, or was there a mix of that and residential?
Yeah, there was a mix of residential. Kind of what we're seeing now with the apartments going in and the upper stories in those downtown businesses. I don't know how common it was, you know, for maybe the shopkeeper to live in those apartments, but, you know, they definitely rented those rooms out.
There were actually very large, expensive houses right downtown.
Yeah.
Right
Oh,
on
yes.
Cameron, Piccadilly, especially next to the courthouse. All those homes were huge. Really. Yeah. Lot goes on.
Yeah. Yep. You'll have to catch the first round because I covered a lot of those houses in another presentation called Vanished Winchester. So that is also on our YouTube channel. Yep.
People were involved in those industries at their peak.
I believe the woolen mill, and I think this was during World War II, I believe it was 500, and this building, which was cotton, we'll talk about next, was about 200 people. And at one point they were going basically 24 hours a day at the woolen mill to keep up with production.